Changing Overwatch from 6v6 to 5v5 has decimated the tank role. What's up everybody, this is Master Ian Gamer. Lately there's been a fairly big resurgence in the Overwatch community when it comes to the debate over 5v5 versus 6v6. It's been brought up by prominent community members like Samido and SVB via his Group Up podcast, both of which are very good discussions of the topic. I do recommend you check those out. I will have them linked down in the description. But I wanted to throw my own proverbial hat into the 5v6 ring, because this is actually an aspect of Overwatch which I do have quite a few thoughts on. As you can probably tell from the title of the video and the introduction and everything, I do pretty solidly land in the camp of preferring 6v6. And there's quite a few reasons why. Before we delve into it though, I do think it's also worth acknowledging that, unlike many of the people who I've been seeing talk about the 5v5 versus 6v6 issue, I'm not a super highly ranked competitive player. I'm not grinding to hit Grandmaster or top 500. I'm much more of just an average casual type player. Sure, I have a YouTube channel and talk about Overwatch constantly, but I've always been someone who's enjoyed Overwatch more as a casual experience rather than being super competitive. Heck, it's a good season for me if I manage to even hit Diamond on tank, which is why I wanted to approach this topic from the more casual, average player's perspective, since it's a position which I don't think we've seen really discussed enough from those in the community who are leading the conversation. That's not to say no one's addressed the casual side of this debate, but simply that I'd like to present my own position as someone who's been a casual Overwatch player and a tank main in both Overwatch 1 and 2. So, getting into the video proper, I want to break down this video into three major aspects relating to the tank role and how they've been changed and impacted with the change to 5v5. These are the change in the diversity of tank playstyles, the change in the level of engagement of actually playing the tank role, and also the degree of toxicity players experience while playing tanks in 5v5. So first up, let's talk about diversity. In Overwatch 2 with 5v5, there is significantly less tank diversity than what we saw with 6v6 in Overwatch 1. And that's even considering the fact that Overwatch 2 has gained 3 more tank heroes. I'm sure the reason behind this is obvious. When you have 2 tank heroes per team as opposed to just 1, the fact that you can have different combinations of that set of tank heroes allows for way more options and combinations of how the tank role is actually made up in any given match. For example, looking at the 11 tank heroes we have currently at the time of me making this video, in Overwatch 2 with 5v5, this allows for 11 different options to be played on any given team when it comes to the tank role. However, if Overwatch 2 was still 6v6 and there were still 2 tank heroes per team instead of just the 1, this would instead allow for 55 unique combinations of tank heroes making up that team's role. 5 times the number of combinations of tank heroes. This alone brings up replayability issues, where if you're someone who plays predominantly the role of tank, while the number of options you may have as an individual tank player may be the same, which is that it's 11 whether there's 1 or 2 tank heroes per team, the fact that you don't have that second tank to help complement your role as a tanking character drastically reduces the number of unique experiences you can end up having while playing tank. Sure, the other roles being damage and support will factor into that to some degree, and of course whatever the enemy team is running will impact that as well, but when it comes to how a single team builds up its own tank line, there are significantly fewer options in 5v5 than 6v6. And one of the biggest problems that actually comes out of this is how it amplifies the rock, paper, scissors dynamic of tank matchups. Now, historically, Overwatch has always held a sort of pseudo rock, paper, scissors dynamic to it. One hero is good at countering another hero, who's then good at countering another hero, who's then good at countering that first hero again. It's a sort of circular cycle where you can swap up your hero to better deal with whatever the enemy's running, and honestly, it's always been a hallmark of Overwatch as a game. Unlike many similar games of this nature, you can swap your hero mid-match, which allows for countering more effectively. However, I don't believe it was until we got 5v5 in Overwatch 2 where we really saw this rock, paper, scissors dynamic reach a point where it became problematic for the actual enjoyment of the gameplay. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that with only a single tank per team, you don't have that secondary tank to help offset the weaknesses of whatever tank it is you're playing. And as such, it ends up being the case that tanks get countered really easily, to the point that if you don't swap off whatever tank you're currently playing that's getting hard countered by the enemy tank, you're probably just going to lose. Now again, the tank heroes don't exist in a vacuum. There are other aspects of a team that can help to offset these weaknesses, such as having your damage or support teammates make up for those weaknesses, but having played Overwatch 2 for nearly a year now, I'm pretty confident in saying that damage and supports don't often end up filling this role to that degree, at least not to nearly the same degree as what we saw with the second tank heroes we had back in Overwatch 1. In 6v6, if you were playing D.Va and the enemy team had a Zarya, it was honestly not that uncommon to make that scenario work for you by having your other tank be Reinhardt or some other character who's good at dealing with Zarya and keeping her at bay. But now in 5v5, if you're playing D.Va and the enemy has a Zarya, you as an individual player on that hero needs to be significantly more skilled than the enemy in order to have any chance whatsoever of dealing with her. And because of that, more times than not, this leads to a sort of incessant, perpetual swapping of tank heroes within any given match. You start off playing D.Va, the enemy goes Zarya, you then swap to Winston, and then they swap to something else that counters you, and the cycle just ends up repeating itself for the entire match, or until one player just gets sick of swapping off their hero. While hero swapping may be a fundamental element of what makes Overwatch unique as a shooter game like this, that doesn't mean that it feels good to have to swap heroes every single time you die. Not only does that outright hinder your ability to have an ultimate, since you're just going to be losing ult charge most times you swap to a different hero that way, but also it just drastically interrupts the flow of playing the game itself. Let's be honest, the vast majority of players aren't equally proficient at playing every single hero in their role. Let's say you're really good at D.Va and really like playing her, but you're terrible at Winston. Oh, well, the enemy runs a Zarya, and now you gotta swap to Winston or somebody else who can better deal with her beam. And in that case, not only are you playing a hero you don't want to have to play, but also you're playing a hero who you're not as skilled with, and as such, you're probably going to perform worse in the match, which will then, of course, probably lead to you having a worse time. And what's more, tied into this tank heroes hard countering enemy tank heroes who don't have a secondary tank to offset their weaknesses, historically, since the launch of Overwatch 2, we've actually seen this result in very few tank heroes ever really being viable at any given point in time. Despite the 11 tank heroes that exist on the roster, maybe 3 of them are viable to run at any given point in a competitive space, and even then they'll often end up devolving into the circular rock, paper, scissors swapping dynamic. And while a given hero being meta or trash tier is by far nothing new to Overwatch, I don't think we've ever really seen a case of it being this extreme and for this long a period of time as we've seen with tank heroes in Overwatch 2. Without the nuance of having 2 separate factors being the 2 separate tank heroes in 6v6, it truly becomes a very straight up rock, paper, scissors type dynamic. Who's gonna protect D.Va from the enemy's Zarya? Maybe a support could try to do something, or the damage could try to focus the Zarya so much that she doesn't have time to deal with D.Va. But again, realistically, in my own experience of playing Overwatch 2 and the experiences I've heard from others, this very rarely ever ends up being the case, which then only further adds to the stagnation and monotony of playing tank overall. The point I mentioned earlier about the tank role having only 11 options as opposed to the 55 options it would have with 2 tank heroes in it, realistically, that's more like 3 or 4 tank options with just the single tank, given how the tanks end up hard countering each other. But moving on now to the next major aspect of this discussion, we have something which ties in very closely to what I just covered regarding the diversity of tank heroes in Overwatch 2 5v5, which is the engagement of actually playing the tank role. Now, admittedly, this is probably going to be the most subjective overarching category I talk about here, as, of course, different people enjoy different aspects and elements of games and characters, so what I say here isn't necessarily going to apply to every single single tank player, but it's certainly something which I personally have experienced and have seen to be quite prominent with other tank players who play Overwatch 2. And one thing which I think we really miss out on with the 5v5 format is that you no longer have that tank partner, and thus you miss out on all the fun and engaging playstyles that came about by creating different tank dynamics, combos, and just the general enjoyment of tank duo camaraderie. For me personally, by far the best feeling I've ever had playing Overwatch in either the first or second game is when I'm popping off on Wrecking Ball. But the second best experience I've ever had is being part of a well-coordinated, well-executed Rein Zarya combo. Something about Reinhardt and Zarya, those two just worked so well together, and the plays you could pull off when the two of them were working perfectly in sync was phenomenal. Whether it's charging in as Reinhardt knowing that the only thing keeping you alive is your Zarya's ability to bubble you, or playing as the Zarya and knowing that the only thing keeping Reinhardt alive is your ability to bubble him. For both tank heroes in that scenario, it's such a powerfully fun level of trust and engagement, which we simply fail to see anywhere within the tank category in Overwatch 2. Maybe you could have something similar if you're playing a tank hero and your Kiriko Suzu's you at the perfect time or your Baptiste lamps you, but honestly, in my experience, it's not nearly the same. In Overwatch 1, there was always some degree of camaraderie between the two tank players. It's something that's very difficult to explain or quantify in any meaningful way, which is why I don't want to dwell on it too long, and I will admit it's a fairly subjective point, but it is an element of 6v6 which I enjoyed tremendously back in Overwatch 1 that simply doesn't exist whatsoever in Overwatch 2. And yeah, I know not everybody had that same experience with tank duos back in the good old days, but a lot of us did, and it's really unfortunate for the tank role to have lost that component that was so appealing to so many players. I'm willing to bet this is one of the major reasons why even after Blizzard removed an entire tank slot from each team in a match, we still pretty regularly see the queue times for tank heroes being pretty low. I won't delve too much further into this right here and right now because it's something I'll be coming back to a little bit later in this video when I focus on some of the rebuttals I commonly hear when it comes to 5v5 versus 6v6, but I do think it has a major impact on the engagement and enjoyment of playing the tank role. Now, another element of the engagement of playing tank in 5v5 is that having only a single tank per team puts a tremendous amount of pressure on that lone tank hero. Not only are they playing arguably the most powerful role in the entire team's composition, but they're filling that role alone. You don't have that secondary off tank to help you tank and stay alive on the front lines. Now that's all on you. Granted, the support role in Overwatch 2 has kind of been getting pushed in the direction of being more off tank-esque, like what we saw with the off tanks in Overwatch 1. And I'll be honest, I don't even really inherently think that's a bad thing. I kind of like the idea of a hero like Brigitte being a support hero, but filling the role of an off tank in a sense, even if that isn't really how she ends up manifesting in Overwatch 2. But regardless, when you shift what was conventionally part of the tanking role into the role of the supports, while sustainability might overall end up being pretty on par with what it was in Overwatch 1 through just the sheer healing and supporting abilities we now see on the support roster, that's still removing power, options, and engagement from the tank role. It's almost reaching the point where it feels like the support role is eating the tank role. They're taking what was conventionally tank-focused mechanics and utility and harboring them for themselves. I do think there's a reason why support heroes are currently the longest queue times, because in a lot of ways, I feel like they've been almost robbing the tools from their teammates. And I don't want to go too far off on a tangent here, because this could honestly warrant its own separate video, but tanks aren't even the only role to suffer from this. With heroes like Illari and Kiriko having pretty good damage potential, we're also seeing supports steal from the damage role now. Again, this is probably too big of a side tangent for this video, and I'll maybe come back to it later, but it does factor into the experience of playing tank in Overwatch 2. A lot of the really cool, fun, and engaging plays that you were able to make in Overwatch 1 by having a duo of tank heroes working together has now either been stolen and given to the support role or snapped from existence entirely. And this again ties back to what I mentioned in the diversity section of this video, where the tank role itself feels so much simpler and stale. There's less options for playing the tank role, those options that do exist are often far less nuanced and engaging, and overall I think it makes for a worse tanking experience. Now again, this whole category I believe is fairly subjective, and I'm sure there are quite a few people who love playing tank in Overwatch 2, far more than they ever did in Overwatch 1, and that's fine. Everyone's going to have their own preferences in that regard, and if you are someone who prefers Overwatch 2 tanks over Overwatch 1, then good for you. I'm genuinely glad that there are people out there who enjoy them. But based on my own experience and the experience I tend to see others bringing up in the community, and the evidence implied by the very, very short tank queue times we've seen for a while, I'm confident in saying that overall, tanks in Overwatch 2 aren't as engaging or enjoyable to actually play. And speaking of the absence of enjoyment in the tank category, now let's move on to the third major portion of this video, which is that while playing tank in 5v5, you open yourself up to far more toxicity than you ever saw as a tank player in Overwatch 1, and far more toxicity than any of the other roles tend to receive. Now again, this might be a sort of subjective point in that, depending on who you play with and what sort of situations you play in, you're probably going to be prone to receiving more or less toxicity, but by and large, I have certainly noticed more toxicity aimed towards the tank players on a given team than we did back in the good old days of 6v6. And in a way, this almost seems sort of strange. After all, tanks make up a disproportionately small number of players on any given team relative to the 2 damage and 2 supports, and yet still, oftentimes, the tank player seems to be the one who gets targeted with the most team toxicity. And for this section in particular, I unfortunately think we're going to have to delve a little into human psychology. First and foremost, by the very nature of the role that tank heroes fill in a given match, everyone in that match, both allies and enemies, are hyper aware of everything those tank heroes do. First and foremost, let's just start by envisioning the physical positioning of heroes in a given match for a particular team. Typically, more or less, it's the case that the tank hero is the hero in front, the damage heroes are the ones occupying the center region, and the supports are going to be in the back. Now, of course, it doesn't always play out this simply. There is a ton of variety. You could have DPS flankers like Tracer or Genji pushing forward past the tank. You could have more close range supports like Brigitte or Lucio playing more in the middle or even up front where the tank is as well. So by no means am I saying this is the positioning of every team in Overwatch 2, but more or less this is how teams position themselves when trying to push objectives and hold points and all those sorts of scenarios. Now, what do you notice about this arrangement? Well, considering that all 5 heroes are facing forward, that means all 4 damage and support heroes have eyes on the tank, which means they're hyper aware of everything that hero and that player specifically ends up doing. For example, let's say the tank is playing Orisa, and she's trying to fight off against the enemy team, and she's using her different abilities, and she throws a javelin to try to stun an enemy player out of channeling their ultimate or something, but completely whiffs their javelin throw. All 4 of her teammates are probably going to see her whiff that throw. However, then let's shift to the support heroes, the players in the back. Let's say instead of Orisa throwing a javelin, the Ana attempted to sleep the ulting enemy with her sleep dart and completely whiffed landing her sleep dart. Who here is going to realize that she even fired a sleep dart? Maybe the other support will notice, and the enemy team will almost certainly realize she whiffed the sleep dart. But when it comes to her teammates, they are oblivious to how severely she just screwed up. For all they know, her sleep dart may have been on cooldown. Maybe the enemy Tracer was about to kill the other support and she used sleep dart to save them. It might not be her fault that the enemy was able to pull off their ultimate. Now, I very much want to clarify that I am not trying to tell people that they should be tilting at their Anas every time they miss their sleep dart, but rather that when someone does end up tilting over the failures of their teammate, let's say, it's more likely that that tilting and toxicity is going to be targeted at a tank player and their actions relative to anyone else on the team simply by the disproportionate amount of presence the tank has relative to damage and supports. And again, this isn't necessarily a perfect example, since ideally a team would be communicating through voice chat, and thus they would know whether or not Ana has her sleep dart on cooldown. But again, I'm coming from all this from a fairly average, mid-tier player's perspective. And what do you see in the medal ranks of competitive, and especially across the board in quick play? Very little voice chat communication. People are not communicating nearly enough for that sort of component to come into play in these types of scenarios. All you have to go on are the sound effects from the game itself and the things you can visually see on screen, which means you're most likely going to see every single mistake the tank on your team makes, while missing a lot of the mistakes made by the damage and supports. Even regardless of positioning, the fact that the tank hero is the powerhouse of the team and is more often than not physically the largest hero on the team even further adds to the team's hyper awareness of that character. Sure, this means that you'll notice all the amazing plays that Orisa does pull off, but I think we all know enough about human psychology to know that people tend to hyperfixate on the negative more than the positive. Even if Orisa lands a dozen perfectly executed javelin throws in a match, everyone's gonna remember the one she absolutely whiffed, which led to them losing the team fight. Now here's the thing, this also applied back in Overwatch 1. The positioning of tanks relative to damage and support was basically the same orientation as what we see in Overwatch 2, but the fact that there were more players present on the map at any given time meant that you'd be more likely to miss seeing the Orisa miss her javelin throw. Even though Orisa didn't have javelin back in Overwatch 1, let's say Roadhog and his chain hook for example. If Roadhog whiffed throwing out his hook and happened to miss one of those enemies right when they were pulling off a huge ultimate that ended up winning the enemy the team fight, not only are you more likely to miss out on that having happened because of all the additional visual clutter of having 2 extra players present, but also you wouldn't necessarily solo dump the blame of having lost that team fight onto that Roadhog because there was another tank hero up there. That other tank hero maybe could have used Defense Matrix or Fortify or Grasp or who knows what to negate the effects that ultimately won the enemy the team fight. With only one tank hero per team in 5v5, all that weight is on that lone player. So when they mess up, everyone is hyper aware of it, and when there's only one singular player on the team making up that tank front line, it's really easy for a toxic teammate to single out that single player and pin the whole team's failure solely on them, which overall I believe is a major factor in why we so often see the tank player on a given team end up getting hit with so much more toxicity than the other roles, which then of course contributes back to why many people now no longer enjoy playing tanks. Now, there is one other prominent element I'd like to touch on here when it comes to toxicity and how it's often aimed towards tank players, which again factors into the sort of hyper-awareness people typically have towards the tank role in general. I already mentioned the excessive attention tanks in general tend to draw to themselves, given their relative size, positioning, and prominence within the team, but also there's the element of players being hyper-aware of the tank meta. Now, I'm not terribly sure why tank metas are the ones that stick out so much more than damage or supports. But regardless, for example, right now, think about who the meta tank hero is at the moment in Overwatch 2. If you're watching this video around the time I've published it, then you're likely going to say Orisa or maybe Zarya, who was recently changed and seems to be on the rise. But then tell me, who are the meta supports? Is it Kiriko? Is it Lifeweaver? Is it Illari? Who are the meta damage heroes? Is it Sojourn, Echo, Soldier? Some heroes from the damage and support categories may stick out as being more prominent in any given balance patch over others, but they don't nearly hold the same level of singular meta that we see with tank heroes. And what's more is that everyone, regardless of the role they personally play, is very much aware of which tank is currently meta. And what this means is that if you have a tank hero on your team who isn't playing that meta hero, you're going to be far more likely to call out and trash talk them because you're going to feel like they're throwing the match by not playing that meta hero. Never mind that this guy is an absolute god on Doomfist and is easily carrying your team. team, the fact that they're simply not playing Orisa or Zarya means in your mind they're throwing the match, which again leads to more targeted toxicity that disproportionately focuses on tanks over damage and supports. Alright, having covered my three major categories now, I want to move on to some of the rebuttals I often see when it comes to 5v5 versus 6v6. So far in this video, I have been prominently focusing on simply how 5v5 impacts tank heroes specifically, but I will be broadening things just a little bit here with some of these, because a lot of these are things which I've sort of been wanting to talk about and address for a long time, and I feel like this is probably the best opportunity for me to sort of delve into these, and specifically their arguments for why 6v6 wasn't better than 5v5. And the first and by far most common argument I hear of this sort is that double shield was too oppressive and it had to be fixed by removing one of the tank heroes. I see this brought up everywhere in the comments of my videos and random Twitter posts I have nothing to do with. Everywhere. And while I will admit that double shield was an annoying playstyle for most players and did exist for an annoyingly long period of time back in Overwatch 1, did fixing it really necessitate culling an entire player from a team? Let's think about some other ways that theoretically could have fixed the double shield meta that everybody hated so much. They could have reworked and implemented balance changes for existing heroes in the game. They could have added a new hero who in some way or another counters the effectiveness of having two barrier tanks on a team. Or they could have added a sub-role within the tank role where only one of the two tank players could play as a barrier tank. Are you seriously telling me that none of these options were easier or more straightforward for Blizzard to implement than to shift to 5v5, a change which necessitated the partial rework of basically every single hero in the game, as well as most of the maps. While every Overwatch 1 hero may not have gotten a rework on par with Bastions or Orisas with the launch of Overwatch 2, every single hero was changed to some degree to accommodate for having only 5 players per team instead of 6. Do you have any idea how much time and effort that must have taken on the back end for the Overwatch developers in order to implement? Do you seriously think reworking the entire roster of heroes was easier than executing a targeted fix of double shield? The real reason I think we didn't see Blizzard do something like this is something which I've actually seen a number of people bring up at this point already, which is that by the time double shield really became as oppressive as it was in the latter days of Overwatch 1, where Sigma and Orisa were overbearing, and even in many of the lower ranks, at that point Blizzard was already heavily focused on the development of Overwatch 2. They didn't want to necessarily put in the time and effort to rework older heroes in Overwatch 1, knowing that everything was going to change in Overwatch 2. And as such, I think the devs kind of intentionally left double shield as it was for a prolonged period of time, because in terms of their own work distribution, it wasn't worthwhile to tackle it at that stage in Overwatch's life. Had we seen double shield pop up at a different point in time for Overwatch 1, perhaps back when Goats was super dominant as a meta, or even the early days where Dive was super oppressive, we likely would have seen a more reasonable change to the hero roster and the heroes present in the game and the balance of things that would have fixed double shield. So while 5v5 may very well have fixed a double shield, was it really necessary to implement this sort of change, which had this extent of collateral and negative side effects for the tank role that 5v5 has had in Overwatch 2, simply to fix double shield? Again, I think this is a scenario where it depends heavily on the individual player. Obviously, tank players are the ones who've suffered the most from this change, and I'm sure damage and supports who really hated going up against double shield aren't really focused on it in such terms, such that they'd be like, sure, 5v5, whatever, doesn't really impact me. But for the people who like playing tank heroes, it has had quite the impact. Now, the other major rebuttal to 6v6 being better than 5v5 is something I alluded to a bit earlier in this video, which is that in Overwatch 1, tank queues were super short, and as such, removing one of the tank slots per team was done to better align the match role distribution to what players actually wanted to play. If fewer people wanted to play tank heroes in Overwatch 1, then why not necessitate fewer tank heroes in Overwatch 2? And honestly, I think this is a fairly reasonable argument to make, but it has its issues as well. First and foremost, for much of Overwatch 1's life, supports were by far the least played role. Towards the end of Overwatch 1, tank may have ended up being the least desired role, but why didn't they make it 5v5 where you cut out one of the supports during a time where nobody wanted to play support heroes? In Overwatch 2, initially it had an issue where nobody wanted to play support, but then they managed to fix that by introducing new support heroes like Lifeweaver and Illari, and at the time of me making this video at the very least, support is by far the longest queue time now because everybody wants to play it. So couldn't Blizzard have done a similar thing with the tank role instead of cutting an entire player slot from it? Add better incentives to play tank while still maintaining 6v6 and 2 tank roles. It's clearly worked for supports, so why couldn't it have worked for tanks as well? Plus, that's not even mentioning the fact that despite the removal of one of the 2 tank slots, Overwatch 2 has reached a point where tank queues are often the shortest once again. Despite each team having half as many tank players on it as it does damage or supports, the matchmaker still struggles to find enough people to play tank. And I personally think the reason for that is because of everything I already mentioned in this video. In trying to adjust the matchmaking to necessitate fewer tank players, they have merely perpetuated the problem of people not wanting to play tank. Removing that 6th player slot, removing that 2nd tank hero on a team has made the tank role so much less enjoyable for the average player that we are now exactly back where we started in terms of queue times for the role, but with the role itself being far less enjoyable. Which is why I very firmly believe that overall 5v5 is worse for Overwatch than 6v6, and it's especially the case for the tank role. Now, I'm not saying that 5v5 is objectively a bad direction or that it destroys Overwatch as a game. Even with 5v5, I enjoy playing tank heroes. I don't enjoy them as much as I did back in Overwatch 1, but I still get a lot of fun out of playing them, and Overwatch overall as a game I still think is very fun to play, even with 5v5. There are also certainly a number of benefits that I'll acknowledge did come about via 5v5. In general, matchmaking is a lot simpler and quicker because it has to find fewer players per match. It allows for easier coordination between teams because you have to keep track of one less teammate. And there are certainly a ton of people out there who genuinely enjoy the changes to any given role that have come about with 5v5. And I can respect that. And I'm glad there are people out there who enjoy it. But I firmly believe that overall, the game has suffered from shifting from 6v6 to 5v5, and that tanks in particular have been severely decimated by this change. Hopefully, going forward, we'll reach a point in time where even with the 5v5 structure, Blizzard manages to revise the tank role or make adjustments to it or something to offset how devastated the role has been by this transition. But for the time being, and for the past year of Overwatch 2 having been a game that exists, we have yet to reach that point. Maybe with this upcoming Roadhog rework, things will end up changing and we'll see the first major step towards making tank heroes feel as good to play as they were back in Overwatch 1. But until we see some hard evidence of that, I'm gonna keep holding my position that 6v6 overall was better than 5v5. And on that note, thank you all so much for watching this video. This ended up being a very long one. I've been wanting to talk about this for quite a while. I never quite felt like it was the right time though, because I hadn't really pieced together enough of my thoughts to have a sort of cohesive stance on the 5v5 versus 6v6. But especially with other creators in the community having brought it up recently, I thought it was a good time to touch on it and give my own thoughts to this conversation that's been happening. And speaking of which, I would love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments down below. Do you agree that 5v5 was a bad direction for Overwatch and that it's terribly hurt the tank role specifically? Or do you disagree? Do you think 5v5 has a number of other benefits that 6v6 never could have brought to the game, and thus the game is better for it with only 5 players per team instead of 6? I know there are a ton of arguments on both sides of this debate, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it down in the comments below. And after you do, be sure to subscribe, hit up that bell icon, come follow me on X, and join my Discord server to hang out and never miss out on any of my future Overwatch 2 news, streams, and other content. And special thanks to my YouTube channel members who help make these videos possible. If you'd like to join them to earn some cool rewards, then just hit that join button down below. And otherwise, this is Master Ian Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.